Good evening, everyone. My name is Nabila, and I am from Loving Kindness Reiki and Yoga in Clemens, North Carolina. And I welcome you to another Saturday Sutras discussion. And this would be our last one for June. And I hope you join me in July because I'm going to be talking about the Tantric Sutras, so the Radiant Sutras. And I'm looking forward to sharing those meditations and those really beautiful, exalted sutras or threads with you because they're just really beautiful meditations, poetry. And we'll even break down some of the Sanskrit words, which have some really deep and beautiful emotional meaning to them. So I hope you join me in July I think I'm going to be doing it on Wednesday, so just check the calendar with K10. And let's get started tonight. Before we begin our discussion, let's go ahead and check in. So we'll start to bring in our energy. So sitting up nice and tall. So if you're sitting in a chair, your feet will be flat on the floor. If you're sitting on the floor, having your legs crossed at mid-shin or have your legs out straight, whatever feels more appropriate for your body. And if it is appropriate for you, then go ahead and close your eyes. Otherwise, look softly at an object of choice or the floor. So we're starting to bring in our energy into this present moment, leaving all the other list making and other thoughts aside. Feel free to leave them in a place in your mind where you can come back to them if you need to. But at this moment, we're coming into this space, coming into this energy, and also being open and receptive to these new teachings. So as we begin to inhale, we're starting to bring in prana or life force. We're bringing in the divine aspect of ourselves, and on the exhale, we're dispensing any of those feelings or thoughts that they don't longer serve us. So we're releasing those. And also, as we begin to inhale, we're starting to create some length in our spine. Tops of our shoulders are soft, our belly's soft. Shoulder blades are coming back towards one another. And the collarbones are spread. So even though we're creating a sense of effort, we also have some ease on our body. So again, we're coming into this with an intention of being receptive to the teachings of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. These teachings are ancient, but still quite relevant to today's living and helping us get through our day with grace and ease. We'll take another couple intentional breaths in and out. And then let's bring our hands up into prayer position or Anjali Mudra with our thumbs at our breastbone. So we have the outside of our hands pressed together and we leave a little space in between our palms. Bringing our chin down towards our chest. surrendering to the divine within us, the truth that lies in union with our divine source, our spirit, our God. And then allow your hands to come down to your lap and then slowly return your gaze to the room. Okay. So let's get on with our discussion. So tonight I'm going to be talking about parinama. And this is related to change. And we have a lot of changes going around in our life right now. Our culture has changed quite a bit, and change can be difficult for people, and it can cause a lot of suffering if you don't know how to deal with that change or start to roll with that change. So it's one of our biggest life lessons that we can start to study and figure out how to deal with, because if we can get that tool in our toolbox, then we can live a much sweeter life, no matter what comes at us. So no matter what the waves are. So, because the thing is, it's not realistic to expect a life that is constantly smooth sailing all the time. There's going to be storms. There's going to be ups and downs, and how we deal with that is the key. A lot of people ignore it, so they'll have crap going on in their life and they'll just kind of ignore it and pretend it doesn't happen, and then they internalize a lot of that, and it shows up in their bodies as chronic conditions, illness, disease. So, or they'll have repressed feelings and towards others, so that's always another possibility. And then some people can really roll with the punches. And so everybody's unique, but with the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, he really helps us get a guideline of how to work with these changes. So I have a kind of a reading here from Nikolai Bachman, who's a wonderful source for the Yoga Sutras. If you really want to find an accessible way to access these teachings and get a great commentary, then I highly recommend Nikolai Bachman's teachings. So he says in Sutra 4.14, every object is a unique combination of the gunas at a particular moment in space or time due to the continuous changes occurring in matter. Okay, so that's a lot of words right there. Let's break that down a little bit. So first of all, gunas. When we talk about the gunas, we talk about the different different kinds of energies that come up in our lives. So some of the three gunas are sattva, rajas, and tamas. And they're universal energies that are always in flux, are always changing. So they're really the epitome of parinama, because it's always in flux. So sattva is that kind of everything's chill. So it's really about the clarity, everything's good, smooth sailing. So that's our sattva. And that's our natural state. However, we are not always there. We might see parts of that, and we might have like little moments of that, but more than likely that we're kind of going between rajas and tamas. So rajas is the quality of passion, distraction, and turbulence. It seeks power and stimulation. Rajas is instant pleasure that quickly diminishes into pain and disharmony. So that's kind of what we're in right now in our culture, because we have so much disturbance in the way we're living. We're not living the way that we were a year ago. So there's a lot of that rajasic energy going on right now. And it also has to do with anxious thoughts, fear, anything that is making us agitated, even insomnia. So that's where that rajasic, where our mind is just filled with those vrittis that we talked about in week 1, I believe. So that's where we have all those vrittis just eating away at us all the time, those little niggling thoughts. So that's a more of a rajasic state. And then our tamasic state it's the quality of inertia, darkness, stagnation. It's kind of that lethargy that follows the rajasic state. It's where you feel like you're getting in a rut, or, there might be some depression, and it could even go even further than that. So when you're in tamasic state, that's where you can also get into some really dark, violent tendencies, eating really bad food for ourselves, substance abuse, addiction, that kind of thing. So anything that's that darker side, and that's more of the tamasic state. So you think of it you have the tamasic and rajasic states on either end of the spectrum, and you have your sattvic. And this also goes for food, by the way, too, because you have more sattvic food, whereas you might have a tamasic food. So one that's more heavy food is more of your tamasic food. Your sattvic foods are ones that don't cause too much disruption in your digestion, whereas our rajasic foods, you might take peppers, hot peppers, anything that kind of revs up our digestion or gets things moving. So those are the 3 gunas that we're talking about. And you could at any moment sit there and while you're doing your svadhyaya, which is part of our limbs of yoga, or Ashtanga yoga, so you can see how this all ties in, is that when we're doing our self-study at any given moment, it's like, how do I feel? How do I feel? Am I more sattvic, or am I more rajasic, or am I more tamasic? So you can kind of really figure out where you are in that guna flux. And you might even be a little bit of each. So that's what we're really talking about here when we talk about the gunas that they talk about in 4.14. So remember that there's, that's the 4th pada, 14th sutra, and that has to do with change. So again, I'll read that again. So every object, no matter what it is a unique combination of gunas at a particular time, moment, and space, time, due to the continuous change occur in matter. So everything in nature is changing from moment to moment. Even our DNA mutates ever so slowly in the background. Dense or gross objects consisting of predominantly earth and water can change more slowly than subtler objects made of air or gas. So in Ayurveda, because I'm going back to that too, there's certain doshas, because we have 3 doshas in Ayurveda. We have the Vata, which is more of the air and ether, and then Kapha is more of the earth and water, and Pitta is fire, and it also is that oily moisture, or they call it water, but it's more of an oily water. So you can kind of plug in some of where those gunas kind of associate. So the Kapha is more the tamasic, whereas Vata is more rajasic. So that's more of that. And also Pitta, because it is fiery, in that fiery change. So, but they all present differently depending on the different doshas, and that's kind of going way into the weeds, but this can go really deep. So so the heart mind can change instantly on the outside, but deeply held opinions and long-standing habits are much less mutable. Deliberate change to purify the body and heart mind in order to truly connect with our inner awareness requires sincere effort and perseverance, which is abhyasa. So we need that that effort and perseverance over a long period of time. So we can't just like give up and then start later on, just say whatever. This is something that needs to be worked on continuously so we can start to connect to our truth and find our habitual patterns or samskaras and see where we can work on those. So that's how we create deliberate change. And another thing that I like to think of with parinama, because people, especially as we get older, we think that we're going to have the same yoga practice, the same physical level as we did when we were 20. And I get that a lot when I'm teaching yoga, is I'll be in a class and I hear a lot of those, I used to be able to, or I should be able to do whatever that thing is. And the thing is that we are changing objects. That's the long and short of it, is that we don't stay static and we do change over time. And but the thing is, we still see ourselves as what we were. So our perception has changed. I mean, it hasn't changed. So we're always seeing ourselves as that, instead of seeing ourselves what we truly are. But those on the yoga path have the unique ability to start to recognize the changes and see that we're changing, instead of seeing that clouded image of ourselves. Because again, that's what we're working towards with yoga, is to start to clear up that mirror, so that when we look in the mirror, that we see the truth and we're not being disturbed by the truth. Because again, that's part of the vrittis, so that's part of the fluctuations of mind. And that's where it starts to come in, is that we still think we are what we used to be. And when we realize maybe we're not, it hurts and there's suffering involved. So this is the teachings of parinama, that things change. So let's discuss how this change happens. So transformation has three components to it, which applies to the chitta. So the chitta is that heart-mind field, as well as to the gross elements and sensory organs. So the three components of transformation are dharma, which is our characteristic or external form, what it looks like on the outside. Lakshana, which is our potential change over time, past, present, or future. And avastha, state. For example, dirty, clean, tarnished, scratched, etc. So we're going to use the analogy or example of gold. So gold begins in the form of ore in the present. When the gold changes into molten form, then the ore form is past and the molten form is present. So again, so we know that that's going from the dharma, what it looks like, into the lakshana, which is the potential change over time. So when the gold becomes a ring, then the molten form is past and the ring form is present. The ring may stay in this form for many years, during which time its conditions change from new to dirty to scratched to clean, and so on. The gold remains gold throughout all the changes. So what's that saying is that no matter what has gone on with that process of that gold, from when it was first coming in from that rough ore to when it was changed from an ore in the past to the molten in the present, it's still gold. It's just a different form. And then when it's transferred from the ore, the molten, and formed into a ring, it's still the ore, it's still the molten, it's now in a different shape. And then when it's the ring, and over time it gets smudged, it gets dirty, it gets scratched, whatever happens to it, it's still going back, it's still the ore, it's still the molten, it's still the ring, it just has changed. So the whole idea is that no matter what happens in your life, you're still that light of awareness. You're still that shining light of awareness. So you're still the truth. It's just that your form has changed over the years. And that's what happens, is our forms change over the years. No matter what we do, we're still not going to be the same as we were when we were 10. It's just not going to happen. We're going to change. But we're still that which is the truth. And that's what that's telling us, that transformation has 3 components to it, which can apply to the chitta. So that's in Pada 3, so Sutra 3.9 to 312, as well as the gross elements and sensory organs, and that's in 313. And so again, the 3 components of transformation are Dharma, Lakshana, and Avastha. So what it looks like on the outside, the changes over time, and then what its state is. So those are the 3 transformations of change. So back to the gold. So using the example of gold above, the molten gold has become a gold coin instead of a ring. Its new form would assume a different shape and go through potentially different conditions. But by practicing samyama, or inward focus, or really bringing that focus in to study that, so you're studying those 3 components of change, one can understand the progression of change and figure out the past and likely future forms. So parinama is a very important concept to start to really grasp. There is another type of transformation which relates to suffering, or dukkha, mentioned in 2.15. Real change is often difficult and uncomfortable. The easiest way to change is to set an intention and take small steps towards the goal. Rapid change is rarely sustainable, with the exception of change due to trauma or a very intense and life-changing event. So the Yoga Sutras describe several kinds of transformations. So parinama is as follows. First one, transformation into Nirodha. That's 3.9 and 3.10. When the samskaras supporting an active mind are weakened, and those supporting a still mind are strengthened, eventually the Nirodha, or stillness, of the heart mind occurs more often and subjugates the lower samskara. And it becomes easier to still the heart mind than to make it active. This is the most important and difficult transformation because it involves replacing deep-seated habits with a pattern of clarity and stillness. Another type of transformation is transformation into samadhi. That's in 3.11. When scattered attention goes away and one-pointed attention arises, the state of the heart-mind changes into samadhi. So we remember samadhi, that's part of our Ashtanga yoga path. So that is the final limb on our yoga path. that is when we become in union with the divine. So we have become so still and that we can't tell the difference between ourselves and the divine anymore because we've become one. So that's that union. And as we talked about when we talked about the Ashtanga yoga path, we talked about how our samadhi necessarily isn't some final goal necessarily. I mean, it is a final goal as far as, but it is attainable in this lifetime so that you can have moments of samadhi in this lifetime. And then the third transformation is transformation into ekagrata, or one-pointedness, which is in 3.12. And that says when the past thoughts are the same as the present thoughts, the state of the heart-mind becomes one-pointed. That's a lot right there. One-pointed focus. That's a hard place to be sometimes. So let's break down some of these words here too. So we're talking about parinama. So that has two different parts to it. So pari means around, and nama is name. So that's kind of so it's around the name. So parinam is to bend or bow down to be changed or transformed into, and assuming in the form of. So that translation is change or transformation. So some of the things that you can do to start to practice this concept of parinama is to start to look at some different contemplations. Like one of them is, do the changes I intend happen and endure? Why or why not? Or how am I different than I was 5 years ago or 10 years ago? That's the biggest thing, is to really be aware of your changing self. So again, doing a journal. I know that's not a very comfortable thing for many people, is to do a journal, but that's how we can kind of mark our changes throughout our life, and to realize that we are changing beings and we don't stay the same as much as we want to think we do. Have I noticed any behavioral changes based on the events in my past? That's another one that can be revealed by doing our journaling. So the things that have happened in our past can definitely change the way that we are now. And that goes back to our discussion on the kleshas, which we talked about. So some of the things that happen, like one of the kleshas about aversion. So that's avoiding things that happened in our past that weren't pleasant. So we're just like, okay, I'm never doing that again. And so that's an important, we can relate it back to the kleshas that way. That has changed us. And our decision is whether or not we want to allow it to change us forever, or do we want to move beyond that particular incident in our life. And again, some people are, you've heard people, we say it all the time, they're set in their ways, or, they're just stuck. And again, this is all personal. This a decision. Do we want to stay there, or do we want to evolve? And do we want to do that work? Do we want to do that transformation? And it is work, and it does take perseverance, and it does take dedication and willingness to do this practice continuously without interruption. And we talked about that earlier. That's part of the first pada. So that leads us into a little bit talking about dukkha. So dukkha is spelled Duhkah. So dukkha is suffering as opportunity. So in Patanjali talks about dukkha in 2.16, where he says that future suffering is avoidable. If we anticipate suffering, we may be able to avoid it. Sometimes we know in our gut that if we follow through with an action, it will result in suffering. Yet we do it anyway. How many times that we do that? All the time. No matter how, you know, you might look around and say, wow, that person's really got it together, you know, because they're a yoga instructor or they're a spiritual person, but we all go through this. We all go through this where we know in our gut this is probably it's the last thing you want to do, but we do it anyway. And we have good intentions, but we do it anyway because of a lot of factors, and including our past actions and our samskaras. So a lot of what we go through earlier on in our life really does mark how we proceed in our decision making. So that has a lot to do with it. So when we really think about, you know, our family, our upbringing, and the decision making by those around us, maybe how impulsive people are in our family, that it really does have an effect on how we handle it. Or, you know, we might even have an aversion to the way, it's like had a bad experience with a family member or someone that you grew up with, and you were like, I never want to do it that way. So that does change us because we don't live in a bubble and we're affected by what goes on around us. So that's dukkha. In the midst of a painful experience, dukkha, or painful experience, which is dukkha, the heart mind is clouded and it is so difficult to understand why it's happening. At some point, we can step back and think about why. We can learn from dukkha and use it as a tool to reveal our habitual tendencies. So again, we can start to work on self-study to find out what our tendencies are, what our samskaras are, our habitual patterns. And we can also do practices such as yoga nidra to help us work through some of those habitual patterns and start to smooth out the grooves that they cause, that continue to maybe perhaps lead us in the wrong direction or continue to make us make the poor decisions. But there are some advice as to how we can start to reduce our further suffering. So we can look at how closely our habitual patterns or samskaras determine our action or reactions. So again, this is all about really taking the time to study about what we're doing, how we've done it in the past, how we're doing it at the moment, and to really say, oh, okay, half the battle, I'm telling you right now, half the battle is to actually recognize what we're doing. We might not be able to fix it right away, but just having that insight into it's happening is half the battle getting through it. Because there's some people that are walking around completely oblivious to the fact that they're even doing these things. So we're on a good path. At least if you've come this far, that there is that real effort into trying to understand yourself and also learning how to change. And I don't even know if I like to think about a change too much, because it's kind of really evolving into your true self. So you're really changing into what you're really meant to be, your real dharma in the world. So it's almost like involving, or so you're really coming back into your true self. So I like to think of it that way. Some other ways that we can reduce our future suffering is by being around wiser people, teachers, listening to them and noticing how they act. And that could be not necessarily teachers, but it could also be the people that you're around. So the people you're around can really help you reduce suffering if you're around the people that are going in the same direction as you are, or the same good path. So they're walking a beautiful path. Because once you get into people that are perhaps living your samskars that are causing you suffering, if you're living that lifestyle, then you're going to continue with that habitual pattern. However, if you want to be around the people that are going to start to lift you up and walk in the light with you. So it's important to be around those types of people, those teachers, so that you can learn from them. And they don't necessarily have to be teachers in the traditional sense or wise people in the traditional sense, but it's anybody that you feel like offers that light. And you'll know who they are once you start to be around them. And another way to reduce future suffering is through discernment. And discernment is a tool like anything else that you need to hone over time, because discernment doesn't necessarily come from the head. A lot of the discernment comes from being still, practicing those 8 limbs of yoga where we can become still and we can really start to connect with our spiritual guide, so the light within, and discern which messages, where is it coming from. So not necessarily listening to your head, but listening to the heart, which of course is where spirit dwells. So listening to that voice that comes from within, and be able to tell the difference between the two. So that's the discernment part of it. So the direction of yoga moves from the outer to the inner, indirect knowledge from reading, hearing, and inferring, towards direct experience and inner vice. So that's dukkha. And again, that's considered suffering. So if you hear that word dukkha, it means dukkha. So some practices for learning more about what causes you suffering or what brings dukkha into your life. So can you identify, different kinds of suffering? Can you take certain actions to prevent your future suffering? And if you've had suffering in your life, what have you learned from it? Again, this is all about really taking that step back to start to examine your life, examine your tendencies, and seeing what does cause you suffering. And then finally, we're going to go into Sam Yoga, which is the false identification of the seer with the seen. And that comes in 2.23. So again, this is going back to our change, talk about change like we did in the beginning. So confusing what changes with what does not change. So confusing what changes prakriti with what does not change, which is purusha. Thinking they are the same, causing suffering that leads us to inquire as the true nature of each. So Sam Yoga means thinking that the seer and the seeable are the same, when they're actually distinct entities internally mixed together, as salt water are different until they are mixed and seem as one. So the Purusha invisibly pervades the manifest world. The confusion of Samyoga partially results from applying the concepts of time and space, which are qualities of the manifest world, to something that is beyond them. So in Samyoga, again, bringing that back to that false feeling, is that we're too close to the situation. There's no space for observation, and thus we lack a proper perspective. So Samyoga causes suffering or dukkha, and that's in 2.17. When we can distinguish between what sees and what is seen by stepping back and observing a situation, we can put what we perceive in proper perspective. This can be called Vayoga, or union without discrimination, the ability to separate from things that cause suffering. In avidya, which we talked about in the kleshas, is that ignorance, that shroud of ignorance that covers the inner light of awareness. And that is what causes that Samyoga, because it prevents our heart and our heart mind from seeing clearly. And that's where all those kleshas come back in. So once you get on that first klesha of ignorance, then the other kleshas are naturally starting to roll into each other. So we start getting into our asmita and our other kleshas. So if we can start to nip that first one in, that ignorance, so if we can lift that veil of ignorance, then the other kleshas can start to burn away. So breaking down the word Samyoga. So Sam is completely together. Yuj, which is our yoga, that means to unite or join or connect or yoke. And then, so the dictionary version is join completely or associate or superimpose or involve. So when we translate all that, Samyoga is the identification, confusion, or superimposition or correlation. So some things that exercises you can look for Samyoga is to, when you're involved in a situation, think to yourself, am I aware when my perspective is biased from being too personally involved in the situation? Can I step back and see the difference? Or am I so wrapped up that I can't see what is true? So that's something to, when you get into a situation, is can you step back? Can you take that time to step back? And what causes me to remember the distinction between the changing world and the changeless seer? And how does it feel when I remember this distinction? So some of these are the practices that you can do to start to tell the difference between what is seen and the seer. Okay. So I really appreciate all your attention for the last 4 weeks in June, for going through these Yoga Sutras with me. I'll probably bring these back at some point because I think it's very important to really dive deeper into the Yoga Sutras. They really are a wonderful guidebook to helping us get through life with as much grace and ease as we can muster, because Patanjali is realizing that we're living in this world and that things are going to happen, and that we're not going to be able to be a hermit and live in a cave. So we have to be able to find ways to cope with life and to also be kind and live with others. So the Yoga Sutras are an outline for that, and they're very, very important. So I think I might have mentioned it in the first week, So some things that you can do, and one of them is really part of that 8 limbs yoga, is the Ishvara Pradhananda. So it's really about studying these yoga sutras. So each day, maybe finding some time, maybe in the morning, to look at a sacred text such as the Yoga Sutras. I mean, there's others such as the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, the Ramayana. So there's other beautiful ancient texts out there, and they all have lots of pearls of wisdom. So as part of our practice, and what we want to do is start to take a piece of these and study it. So every day, just open up a book, learn about it, see how it comes into our life, how we can start to incorporate into our life, or how it means what it means in our life. And that way, that when a situation comes up, that you have a reference or you have a tool that you can use to work with that situation or that challenge. So you have that. And the only way we're going to do that is to take a little bit of time each day to look at these texts, look at these teachings, and have them ready for us. Instead of going, okay, I'm going through this situation, so let me go find a text and see if I can find a teaching, or getting on Google or something like that to have the help that you need. So it's better just to start a little time, because there's a lot of teachings. These books are quite long. So if you start to just take a little piece at a time and really fully integrate it into your life, or maybe journal about it, that you'll have that tool for you the next time a challenge in your life comes up. So that's something I recommend. Another thing too is to find a recording of the Yoga Sutras that you can chant along with, because that's another way to start to incorporate them into your life, is to chant them. And it's an excellent way to do it as a meditation, because with the chanting and the vibration, that it really does you start to embody the Yoga Sutras as well. So there's some beautiful recordings out there for you. And as on a physical level, the actual chanting and learning how to speak the Sanskrit language, it does help with brain health and keeping the connections in your brain really firing. So it does help with overall brain health and keeping you sharp. So I do highly recommend that you find one of those recordings that you can chant along with and learn this beautiful language of yoga, which is the Yoga Sutras. And I know that all these ancient teachings were actually originally taught orally, so that they weren't put into a book until much later. So they were passed down through chanting. And that's how we have these teachings, because they were chanted in every generation until somebody was able to write them down, so that we have them in their present condition. So that's a great way to honor the traditions of yoga. And that's why we study the ancient texts. That's another reason, is because we want to honor yoga. And because the asana part, just the posture part, is only one small fraction of what yoga really is. When we start learning about it in reading these beautiful books, is that we start to learn what it is off the mat. And that is our goal too, is to have that community, to have that teaching beyond the mat, so that, again, it's only a little tiny part of the whole yoga picture. And there's only 2 Yoga Sutras that even mention asana. So there is a much bigger world out there than doing exercise, or yoga as exercise. So that's what the whole spiel about the Yoga Sutras. I could really talk about them forever and ever. And it looks like my time is just about up. So I hope you enjoyed the last 4 weeks. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me. I'm at Loving Kindness, Reiki, and Yoga. You can find me on Facebook. You can also text me 336-354-5355, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have or even get into this discussion a little bit further. And I really appreciate your time, and thank you to Kristen from K10 Yoga for asking me to do this. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful evening. All blessings.